Thank you for joining us for this edition of BAYS Breaks, where we take a few minutes to talk about current events and some of the innovative work that is happening within our organization. Please remember to follow us and subscribe by clicking on the link in the description below. And remember that BAYS is a nonprofit organization that works in partnership with individuals, families, and communities to inspire change, growth, and success. And today we will be highlighting Women's History Month 2022 with Dr. Heather Curry, who is not only an expert in women's studies, but also the duly elected secretary of the BAYS Board of Directors. Welcome to BAYS Breaks, Dr. Curry.
Thank you so much, Mr. Martinez. It's always a pleasure to do the work with BAYS that I get to do. I did want to note I would not call myself an expert in anything, but I appreciate and am honored by being asked to be here. So I'll try to pretend expertise and not try to get imposter syndrome while doing so.
Well, thank you for that. And you're far more of an expert than I am, as you'll see in the questions that I'm about to ask you. And so today we'll be highlighting Women's History Month, as I said, which is a time dedicated to reflect on the courage of women in past generations and how their efforts and bravery have contributed to the status of women in today's society. And I must admit that in preparing for this interview, I found that in 1901, Annie Edson Taylor, a school teacher from Michigan, became the first person to go over Niagara Falls in a wooden barrel, just to give you a sense of my journalistic acumen. In all seriousness, though, in addition to having earned a PhD, you also have a master's degree in women's studies. What exactly is women's studies, and what should viewers know about the importance of examining social and cultural constructs of gender?
Sure. And that's a huge question. So I toyed around with that some before we started this interview because defining women's studies exactly is a difficult task because there are so many different tracks and areas of focus. So I think the best and most succinct way to say it is that it's a lens through which you can look at the world. And that's what I found when I came to it. I had a clear sense growing up that there was something not right in the water when it came to how women and girls were treated in the world and the way men and boys were treated in the world. And that was from a very young age. And I'll share just a quick story that was one of those moments where I was like, something's wrong here. It's a personal story, but I'll tell you why I think that it's relevant. Is that when my parents got divorced, I remember an aunt came and talked to me, and she said, "I feel really bad for your dad because what is he going to do with two girls?" And that was one of those moments where I was like, "What do you mean? What's he going to do with two girls? Like, be a dad? I don't know. Like, what do you do with boys?" So, it was kind of one of those early aha moments. But I found a home. So I make this distinction oftentimes between rage and outrage. And rage is that which I would say we feel internally, right? And I don't want to say that I raged about that, but I definitely felt something was wrong internally. And then when I came to women's studies, I found that there was a space where I could reflect on that externally and with others and start making sense of the world in a new way. And so I think the critical importance of, and now most departments are women's and gender studies because they realized that it was much more expansive than just talking about women. We had to look at gender more broadly and more deeply, both and say this is a construct in its entirety. So we are not only implicating women in this way, we're going to study them in this fishbowl over here. We're going to say broadly, how are these constructs helping us and how are they hurting us? And where, when people disrupt them, do we suddenly find that political inequity ensues, social and cultural inequity ensues, and oftentimes that can result in its worst case scenario in violence. So in being written out of healthcare systems, political systems, we have a government that has actively taken up a stance of saying we're going to not address the term transgender for the CDC, not currently, that was during the prior administration. But these are things that hurt people. And if we don't understand where we've been, just the benefit of a women's studies lens, then it's really difficult to determine a path forward that is informed, that is inclusive, and that's compassionate. So that's, like I said, it's not an exact definition, but I think at the core of it, like any discipline, it's a lens. And what it leads to, the study itself is not where the activism lies. It's the people who step into that role and say, okay, now that I know this, what am I what is the what am I required to do at this point? Because I'm not just going to sit there with the books. That's cool. But there's another step here. And so it gives us a way of figuring out how to do that, how to do so in an informed, credible, reflective way. So, and I think that it probably already kind of implicitly stated this, but I think that really the critical nature of taking a look at how gender is constructed in our cultural and social settings is that it allows us to see this as systemic and somewhat arbitrary. Right? So we look back and we say these things aren't innate to someone. You're not born into the world wearing a dress or a set of overalls, right? And you're not born saying, I love pink because pink is supposed to be a girl's color, or I love blue because blue is masculine. Those are constructs. And we know that people don't fit in those boxes neatly, and that gender, sex, and sexuality are distinct. Each person has something where they find themselves through those three different kind of that tripartite identity, but they don't always align. And women's and gender studies now was a way of seeing into that and saying we can think about this differently. We need to think about this differently. So I'll leave it at that. That was my attempt at brevity.
Well, that was very informative. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor Kimberly A. Hamlin argued in a Washington Post op-ed that when men make history, it's called history. But when women make history, it's women's history. It's a fair point to keep in mind now, and especially as the country moves forward to a more equitable tomorrow. Can you offer your perspective on some issues that you think are important for us to be aware of as we work toward a more equitable approach?
100%. You and I've had this conversation 1,000 times where at the core of it, for the viewers who don't know, I've been with BAYS for a while, working as a board member, but prior to that, working with juvenile justice issues through the county lens. One of the things that we first started talking about, we started working together, is how can we view this as a matter of equity, right? But that's actually a critical lens to take, because oftentimes where communities have been hit historically by inequitable situations, that's where things like, from my work, human trafficking can emerge. You have greater involvement with the criminal and juvenile justice systems. You have people who are suffering with greater mental health issues and mental wellness issues. You have people who are hit harder by not having access to good healthcare, good transit, good employment. The list goes, good housing. The list goes on and on and on. Now, since we're talking about Women's History Month in particular, I'm going to go back to that point you just made, which is the add women in stir approach or the separation approach. That was our historical lens, was like, okay, history is defined by the victors, whatever. But also those victors tended to be white men. And so many voices were written out. And now when we start looking at things like federal housing authority policy, women have been hit harder by that issue than anyone else. So they had a hard time finding housing. They had a hard time getting loans. They were unfairly treated in getting home loans. They also didn't have the same access to education. A lot of times, especially women of color, didn't have good access to healthcare. That was something, there was a large movement in the 60s and 70s. There are large collectives of Black women and activists who said, we need to really fight for this because women are dying without access to good healthcare. So the issues are far reaching, but I think one thing that we can really lean into, and this is selfish on my part, I'll acknowledge that, but is human trafficking. I think that's one that we can really take on, and a lot of issues with the juvenile justice system. What's going on here, and how can we really address that through the lens of equity? Acknowledging that oftentimes the people who are hit the most are LGBTQIA2 plus community and girls and women. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I think that's yeah, because that's a hot mess, right? I could spend the next 24 hours at least talking about that and not get anywhere. So yeah, I think we've got some low-hanging fruit there.
Okay, well, it seems like we're making some progress, admittedly slow progress, in addressing issues such as the gender gap and pay inequality and more women holding elected office. But what are some of the women's issues that are important to you and that you feel we should place a collective focus on?
So I think certainly pay equity continues to plague us. And in particular, as you move down the line, because as a, evidently cisgender white woman, I don't struggle with some of the same issues as a lot of people of color. Women of color are particularly hard hit by pay equity. That's one. I also think increasing, this is maybe a strange tack for me to take at this juncture, but I think it's important. Creating greater opportunities for financial wisdom and creating that space, because again, even just from a financial standpoint, if you at least have housing and basic pay equity established, then a lot of those other issues of instability are ameliorated. They're not eradicated, but they definitely make a move toward the positive. So that's one thing I think we need to pay attention to. I think the other is the proliferation and prevalence of sexual assault among women, which our statistics have not really shifted a whole lot. The reports of that and the shame and the silence imposed upon that issue have not shifted at all. But the statistics are still showing that at least 51% of women have reported being sexually assaulted by the age of 18. And a lot of them still feel that crushing shame and silence where you can't address that. So I think that that's a huge issue that we need to tackle still. We have not really dealt with that sufficiently at all.
Women have made overwhelming contributions to the world, from Harriet Tubman to Clara Burton's founding of the American Red Cross in 1881 to Amelia Earhart's contributions to aviation. Women have been kicking butt for a long time. Who are three women who have left a lasting impression on you during the course of your life and studies?
Okay. So again, there are so many people who have been influential. So I'll just kind of give a list across the different disciplines that I've found to be really impactful. So from the activist standpoint, definitely Fannie Lou Hamer, Rigoberta Menchú, Guatemalan activists. I've also got my literary influences because I started off as a fiction writer before I went into women's studies. So Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Maya Angelou, those are really impactful women for me. And Simone Weil, who's a beautiful writer, but also an incredible philosopher and an activist in her own right. So those are kind of my top five. I did more than three.
That's okay. We'll give you a couple of extra ones there. And
Okay.
so, Dr. Curry, I want to thank you so much for joining us and for taking the time out of your schedule to participate in this episode of BAYS Breaks, and appreciate all that you do for our organization.
Thank you so
And,
much.
and this concludes this episode. Thank you all for taking a break with BAYS, a nonprofit organization that believes in the value and worth of all people and their ability to change, grow, and succeed. Please don't forget to follow us and subscribe to our channel by clicking on the link in the description below. And for more information about BAYS, you can also check out our website at bayskids.org. And we'll see you next time.